As many of you know, I argue with a lot of people online. A lot. And I find a lot of the discourse revolves around misunderstanding of terms. And to be honest, this is a problem with the academic left. We tend to come up with obscure technical sociological terminology that confuses the layman. So I figured I'd make a quick video going over some of the lingo the leftists use that's problematic and how it is so easily misinterpreted by the right. For starters, the term toxic masculinity. Upon first hearing it, a lot of people jump to the conclusion that the implication is that masculinity itself is what's toxic. They don't understand that toxic masculinity is not an attack on masculinity on a whole, but rather certain faulty stereotypes of masculinity that are actually just toxic personality traits. As a man in the Western world, you've probably quite often been subjected to social expectations that are generally antisocial and emotionally stunted. Things like men don't cry, talking is for pussies. These things are not manly, they're just toxic. You can be very masculine without being antisocial. I would consider Atticus Finch from To Kill a Mockingbird to be a very good example of a masculine and assertive dude who doesn't rely on toxic stereotypes to project a false veneer of manhood. Atticus doesn't carry a gun or haul off and kick the shit out of the townsfolk. So unless you're willfully ignorant, it's blatantly apparent that society has merged its expectations of manhood with some unnecessarily toxic traits. This is why most people would consider Rambo more manly than Atticus Finch, based on nothing but the fact that Rambo displays a more sociopathic disregard for human life. But people don't see it that way. They think any attempt to curb the toxic expectations is an attack on men in general. I feel like this misunderstanding could have been avoided if the term was something like toxic pathology, so it wasn't so gender specific, because women have toxic social expectations as well. They just don't get as much attention because physical violent behaviors are more easily and immediately recognizable. If the term didn't single out male toxicity, there wouldn't be any perceived gender bias surrounding it. Next is the term white privilege. White people have a real knee-jerk reaction to this one. They seem to think that the implication is that all white people live these opulent lives floating through on a cloud. The fact is that a white person, even if you're struggling, doesn't mean you're not still reaping the benefits of white privilege. Which, in my opinion, should have been called majority privilege. Because that's what it is. It isn't based on skin color specifically, but rather who is the majority controlling the state you are under. Chinese people have Chinese privilege in China. On average, they will be treated better by the local population than a foreigner would. The way Muslims are treated there is an example of this. White people are generally blind to their privilege because they don't have a first-hand grasp of how bad anybody else has it. Your white privilege only applies to you in a predominantly European demographic, and all it means is that on average you will face less discrimination based on your skin color. This is both demonstrable and intuitive. Not everyone is a racist, but the ones who aren't likely to target you because they think you're on the same team. White privilege is a minority disadvantage, but because they term it based on skin color, white Caucasians tend to think it's an attack on them or an implication that they don't face any struggles at all. That's not what it means. It just means that minorities in your country are, on average, more likely to face discrimination than you are. Nothing about that negates or diminishes the struggles you have faced as a white person. If you're poor, you still have more in common with these minorities than you do with rich people of the same color. Believe all women is another problematic term. People take it literally as if women are above reproach. What it actually means is that when a woman makes a complaint that it should be taken seriously, just as seriously as any other crime reported by any other person. So instead of believe all women, it should have been take claims seriously. I have mixed feelings on this topic because most of the population already thinks rape is amongst the most abhorrent of crimes, and you'll hear a lot of people who suddenly have no problem with torture and execution when it comes to rapists. But on the other hand, there are countless stories of police and other authority figures dismissing claims or losing rape kits or even taking the side of the rapist. So I don't think it's unreasonable to bring light to the fact that women are often marginalized in this way, and they deserve to have their claims properly investigated. It would be unreasonable to just automatically believe every claim is factual by virtue of their genitals, but that isn't what any rational person was ever advocating for. Defund the police is one that's big in the news right now, and it's another example of misleading language creating bad optics. Defund the police, despite what the name would imply, doesn't mean abolishing the police or taking away their entire funding. It means that the police budgets should be cut, and that money should be diverted to more community programs that supplement the police. This means instead of sending armed officers who are ready for a battle on mental health checkups, we just send actual mental health professionals. Instead of sending armed police to low-stakes domestic disputes, we send counselors and mediators. When some kid is tagging a building, we send a bicycle cop or a community resource officer instead of having a half-dozen cops pull up with guns drawn. Currently, the police buy up old surplus military gear because if they don't max out their budgets, they get even less next year. So that system incentivizes both the militarization of the police and an endlessly inflating budget. Systemic racism has become sort of a buzzword, and the problem is that it's not actually the proper term for what's happening in America. Things that are systemic are inherent to the system and generally encompass it, meaning that they are an intentional and intrinsic part of that system. Racism is not intentional or inherent to the current system. In fact, the current system attempts to be antithetical to racism. Both by right and by law, the system attempts to make these forms of discrimination illegal. In fact, we have one of the few systems in the world that is most opposed to systemic racism and tries to be egalitarian. Jim Crow is an example of systemic racism, because the racism is intentionally baked into the fabric of the system. What you call systemic racism, I would have called extrinsic institutional racism, because most of the racist elements of our society have covertly snuck into the system and are running it in opposition to its intended goals. Yes, it is the institutions being corrupted, which means it is still institutional, but it is not systemic. There are racist people within the system, like judges and prosecutors that give disproportionately high prison sentences to minorities, but that's not the system itself. And there are some unintentional byproducts of certain laws that disproportionately affect certain demographics, like how policies that target the poor happen to affect black people more per capita, but it's rather conspiratorial to think that these policies are intentionally meant to hurt black populations. Only 9% of white people are in poverty compared to 22% of blacks, but that 9% is of a much bigger population. So these policies hurt every poor person across the board. And of course there are the residual effects of actual systemic racism in the past, which have kept blacks and Hispanics and such at an economic and social disadvantage. And despite it being illegal, there are still banks and such that engage in redlining. And there are still politicians that gerrymander minority communities. But these are exploitations of the system by bad faith actors. These are not what the system itself was set up to do. They are the results of individual anomalies within it. Now, a handful of racist judges can do a lot of damage and create a bubble of racism within an otherwise egalitarian system. And lastly, I conclude with the redefinition that racism is prejudice plus institutional power. This is a very convenient way to exclude yourself from the label of racist. Anyone can be a racist if you're allowed to redefine the word. We already have words for prejudice plus power. They're bigotry and oppression. I'm a bigot or a racist. I use my power to hold you down. That is oppression. The oppression in this case is based on racism. Prejudice plus institutional power tells us nothing. It doesn't even mention race. So if I have power and I hold a prejudice against, say, bicycle riders, that makes me a racist by this bizarre redefinition. Because prejudice itself doesn't denote bias against skin color, the word racism does. If a Jamaican and a Mexican are hurling slurs at one another, they are both racist despite neither of them having any institutional power. If that's not true, and it is based on institutional power, then a Muslim in China could call you the
racial slur,
and it wouldn't be racist because he has no institutional power and is equally oppressed. The idea that racism involves power is obviously stupid and riddled with gaping logical holes. Anybody can be a racist. It's only once you give a racist institutional power that they can institutionally oppress you with it. So that's the rundown of leftist language that could probably be tweaked a little to be less confusing to the opposition. Because I'm getting tired of having to explain the definitions before I can even begin to have a cogent argument about it. When people get caught up on the semantics, they lose sight of the actual premises.